Hello, good evening or morning or whenever you're watching it. And this is the Chapter 7 Key Questions. So, the first question on the docket: what ideas influenced leaders and thinkers of the Revolutionary Era? The main ideas I outlined in class and on your outline is republicanism. Republicanism is where citizens willingly give up their private and selfish interests for the common good. This, of course, depends on the citizen's virtue. What this stood for is really they were against the kind of authoritarian monarchies that were around at the time, and they're looking for a group of leaders elected by the people who will represent the people as a whole and not, again, selfish ambitions. Other ideas include the Enlightenment. The ideas came from men like John Locke, who proposed natural rights for all men, that of life, liberty, and property. You also have his majorly influential idea, consent of the governed, that if the government is not run by the consent of the people, then they have the right to overthrow and create a new government. So the second question is, what is mercantilism? How did it impact the colonies and their relationship with Britain? Mercantilism in a larger scale, of course, I've kind of kept it limited to the colonies and the fact that the colonies were there for the mother country's benefit. But in a larger scheme, it is an economic system in which nations need to export more than they import, so they collect more gold. What that does to the relationship with the colonies is it makes them focus on treating the colonies as only a place for natural resources and raw materials that they manufacture and then sell back at a higher price to make money off of them. So that's how mercantilism affects their relationship. Other ideas also include the fact that there are positives for the colonies, including the fact that they were really loosely enforced up to this point, the fact that they were making profits off of it, and that they had protection of the world's greatest navy at the time. Negatives, of course, are that you feel stifled, you feel like you're kind of a child being shepherded by an overbearing parent, and that made the Americans desire their own freedom to develop without British control. So, question number 3 says, how did the relationship between the colonies change following the French and Indian War? Well, first and foremost, it created, because of the massive debt, the British Parliament created taxes that were aimed at making money back to refill their treasury. So before this, as I mentioned before, the colonies had 1/26 the level of taxes levied on them compared to British citizens back home. So Britain gladly justified it, saying, you have not paid your fair share. We fought a war for your land and for your country, and so it's only fair that you now begin to pay your right amount. George Grenville also claimed that they were virtually represented and that Parliament had the right to pass these laws whether or not the colonists had representatives in Parliament. So number 4, describe the colonies' reaction to the Stamp Act. Angry. First of all, they form a Stamp Act Congress. The Stamp Act Congress joins together to organize all the colonies as one and to well, first they list their grievances, and then they actually ask Britain to repeal the legislation. Where they are most effective is when they pass non-importation agreements. When the Stamp Act Congress and other colonies get behind these non-importation agreements, by as agreeing to not purchase British imported goods, it puts a dent in the British economy that scares them into eventually repealing the Stamp Act. Also, you have the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. The Sons of Liberty went about enforcing these non-importation agreements. They would do that sometimes by intimidation. They would do that by tarring and feathering. Pretty aggressive. Whereas the Daughters of Liberty, they supported the measures by creating homespun clothing that would enable people to resist purchasing British goods. So number 5, what happened to the Stamp Act? Well, as I mentioned just a second ago, it was repealed. But what Parliament does right when they repeal it, they pass the Declaratory Act just after it. The Declaratory Act says that even though they repealed this act, in the future they have the right to bind the colonies in all means whatsoever, or in all cases whatsoever. In other words, they have absolute sovereignty over the colonies. And so the colonies don't mind this because they assume that they can just protest like they did against the other acts, and they'll get their way once again. So number 6, what causes the Boston Massacre? Well, first of all, you have the Townshend Acts, and the Townshend Acts create taxes on glass, lead, paper, paint, and tea. Colonists simply refused to pay the taxes and continue to smuggle to get around it. So what happens is, in order to make sure these taxes are collected, Britain sends troops over to enforce these laws and enforce these taxes, and of course to cut down on the amount of smuggling. Those troops create tension inside the city of Boston that eventually erupts as colonists surround a single soldier. Of course, the soldiers come to their friend's defense, and eventually they fire into the mob. So what really caused the Boston Massacre is the presence of troops and the continued insistence by the British to enforce these new taxes. That tension eventually rises and creates the violence of the Boston Massacre. Number 7, how did Samuel Adams lead the colonies toward revolution? Well, he is called the firebrand of the Revolution. He is wonderfully skilled in getting the mob to rise. But the biggest thing he's known for is creating the committees of correspondence. These committees shared the grievances that they were suffering at the hands of the British. They would spread, or rather a network spreads across the colonies that exchanges these letters and this information quickly. Eventually, these committees of correspondence turn into the very first Continental Congress, which will question the king and eventually, of course, lead to the Declaration of Independence in the Second Continental Congress. With that said, so that's Samuel Adams' role. So number 8, why did colonists fight against the Tea Act of 1773? After all, the tea was cheaper. So Lord North, he passes this new law that grants a monopoly to the Dutch East India Company. And the problem is even though the tea was cheaper, it was still a tax tea. Colonists had been bringing in smuggled tea that was a fair price. And so they would rather pay a higher price for, illegal tea that wasn't taxed than pay for tax tea. And so the Tea Act of 1773 leads to the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party is significant because it creates or pushes Parliament to create, number 9, the Intolerable Acts. Now remember, the Intolerable Acts is the name that the colonists give to the acts, whereas the British Parliament calls them the Coercive Acts. So how did they punish Boston? Well, first of all, there's technically 4 that I gave you. First, they restrict representative assemblies inside of the cities. Second, British officers were allowed to go back to Britain for trial, which would probably help them escape justice here in the colonies. Number 3, you also have the continued quartering of British soldiers inside of colonist homes. But the biggest part is that, and the most important, is that they shut down the port of Boston. By shutting down the harbor until all the tea had been paid off, the economy of Boston was going to suffer. So at the same time as they pass these Intolerable Acts, they also pass the Quebec Act. It grants more land to Quebec and the French Canadians. It grants them protection of their Catholic faith and allows it to spread into further deeper into North America. You'll have to excuse Walter out there. It also continues their governance, which had no representative assemblies and no trial by jury. So why was this an untimely mistake? Well, the law itself wasn't that bad because the Canadians had been used to all these things and were actually given more land. What happens is the colonists in the 13 future American colonies interpret this as a potential threat against them and their future as an area with no rights of Englishmen and no representative assemblies. So number 11, what was the purpose of the First Continental Congress? What did it do? What did it not do? Well, the First Continental Congress were brought together in response to the Intolerable Acts. And as they write a letter to the king, they simply said they want to roll back the laws that have been passed upon them, the parliamentary taxes. They want to get rid of the Intolerable Acts. They also gathered together to reinforce the idea of non-importation, only this time they add non-exportation and also non-consumption. So all those things were intended to hurt the British economy, to bend them to the colonists' will, because Parliament clearly wasn't going to do it on their own. What did it not do? Well, the First Continental Congress did not call for independence. What it did was say that if the king does not answer their grievances, and if the Parliament does not react in a meaningful way, then they will meet in 1 year from then in 1775. It is the Second Continental Congress that meets that will eventually declare independence, so that is, I guess you could say, fairly significant. Number 12, where was the first violent incident of the Revolutionary War? How did it happen? Well, it happens in Lexington. As tensions continue to rise following the Intolerable Acts and the creation of the First Continental Congress, and Sons of Liberty get more aggressive, and they begin actually training as Minutemen in the town squares across New England. The British become more and more nervous, and so they decide to send men to grab the weapon stores and the gunpowder stores in Concord. And as they leave from Boston, they encounter a group of Minutemen in Lexington on their way to Concord. Those men refuse to step aside, according to the British, yet according to the Americans, they were beginning to back off when a shot heard round the world rings out. Blam. That didn't sound that loud. Don't know how they heard it. Regardless, that shot rings out. The British unload their weapons on the Minutemen. They charge. 8 die. 10 are wounded. Minutemen are scattered. The British continue on to Concord. No weapons are there because they've been warned. And on their way back to Boston, violence continues as militiamen hiding in the bushes behind fences and on top of or inside of houses pop shots off at the British. This is the first record of violence, and it will not stop for several years as the revolution begins and America will eventually gain its independence. Once again, if you have any questions, I went over this. This is a lot of information for 11 plus minutes. But if you have any questions, just shoot me a message. And I guess this is where I'm supposed to tell you to click subscribe and like, or click like and subscribe. Whatever. You should probably click dislike anyway.